From dominating 80% of the CPU market to bleeding $50 billion and begging competitors to make their chips, this is the story of Intel's catastrophic Foundry mistake. And spoiler alert, while some tech companies learned from their failures, Intel doubled down on theirs. We're talking about a semiconductor giant that went from being the undisputed king of chip manufacturing to watching Taiwan Semiconductor destroy them while they burned through billions, trying to copy a business model they just didn't understand. How does the company that literally invented the microprocessor end up so far behind that they have to outsource their own chip production? Buckle up, because this corporate train wreck involves manufacturing disasters, a mass customer exodus, and enough hubris to make Icarus look cautious. But first, let's go back to a time when Intel thought they were invincible. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the tech world. Back in the early 2010s, Intel wasn't just a big company. They were the undisputed king of computer chips. We're talking about a titan that controlled over 80% of the PC processor market, a dominance they'd held for decades. Their secret weapon? An incredibly advanced manufacturing process that let them make chips smaller, faster, and more efficient than anyone else on the planet. Intel lived by a strategy they called tick-tock. Every 2 years, tick, they'd shrink their transistors to a new, smaller size. Then, tock, they'd introduce a brand new chip architecture. This relentless pace kept them light years ahead of competitors like AMD. It's why those Intel Inside stickers were basically a guarantee of top-tier computing power. But while Intel was busy making their own chips, a whole different world was emerging. Companies like NVIDIA, AMD, Apple, and Qualcomm were designing amazing chips, but not actually manufacturing them. Instead, they outsourced all that work to specialized factories called foundries. Think of a foundry as a high-tech chip factory you can rent. You design the chip, and they build it for you. The biggest and best foundry in the world was, and still is, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. Founded way back in 1987, TSMC perfected the art of making chips for other people. And they were making serious money doing it, tens of billions in annual revenue by the early 2010s. So Intel, sitting on top of their manufacturing mountain, looked at TSMC and had a thought. Wait a minute, we're the best chip manufacturers in the world. We make our own stuff flawlessly. Why don't we open our factories to other companies and just print money like TSMC? In 2010, Intel announced they would start offering foundry services. By 2013, they were actively trying to sign up customers, promising to build chips for anyone who wanted to use Intel's supposedly superior technology. Analysts absolutely loved the idea. It looked like a genius move. Intel could continue to dominate with their own processors and become the go-to manufacturer for everyone else as designs. On paper, it was brilliant. Intel had the technology, the manufacturing expertise, and decades of experience. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out that being great at making your own chips doesn't automatically make you great at making everyone else's chips. And Intel was about to learn this lesson the hard, expensive way. You see, TSMC had been running a pure-play foundry business since 1987. That's over 2 decades of experience learning how to work with hundreds of different customers, each with their own unique chip designs, their own specific requirements, and their own impossible demands. TSMC built its entire company culture around flexibility and customer service. They had to adapt their manufacturing processes to whatever their clients needed. Intel, on the other hand, had spent decades optimizing everything for just one thing, making Intel chips. Their factories, their tools, their entire way of doing things was built around designing and manufacturing their own products their own way. Asking them to suddenly become a service provider for other companies' designs was like asking a master chef who only cooks Italian food to suddenly run a restaurant serving every cuisine on Earth. But Intel was confident, arrogant even. They figured their technological advantage was so massive that customers would come running. After all, Intel had the smallest transistors, the most advanced manufacturing techniques, and the best production yields. How hard could it be? Apparently, pretty hard. By 2014 and 2015, Intel's foundry business was struggling to attract any major customers. Apple, AMD, NVIDIA, they all stuck with TSMC, even as Intel tried to woo them over. It turns out these companies didn't really trust Intel, their direct competitor, to manufacture their most valuable secret designs. Would you hand your secret recipe to a rival restaurant? And then things got worse, much worse. Because while Intel was busy trying to convince other companies to use their factories, their own manufacturing started having serious problems. In 2015, Intel promised their next generation 10 nanometer process would be ready for mass production. For context, nanometers measure how small the transistors on a chip are. Smaller is better, meaning faster chips and lower power use. Intel's 10 nanometer process was supposed to arrive right on schedule, keeping them ahead of the competition. It didn't. The 10 nanometer process got delayed to 2016, then 2017, then 2018. Meanwhile, Intel was stuck producing chips on their 14 nanometer process, which they'd been using since 2014. And here's the beautiful, painful irony. Intel was promising to make everyone else as cutting-edge chips while they were struggling to make their own on time. Awkward. Their competitors definitely noticed. AMD stayed loyal to TSMC. NVIDIA wasn't interested. Apple quietly continued working with TSMC on their iPhone and iPad processors. Intel's foundry ambitions were going nowhere fast. And at the same time, their core manufacturing advantage was starting to crack. But Intel didn't pull back. Instead, they doubled down, just as the wheels were starting to fall off. This is when things went from bad to absolute nightmare fuel. Between 2018 and 2020, Intel's manufacturing problems exploded into a full-blown crisis that destroyed both their foundry dreams and their core business at the same time. Remember that 10 nanometer process Intel promised back in 2015? It finally started shipping in volume in late 2019. That's a 4-year delay. But it gets worse. The yields were terrible. Yields are basically the percentage of chips on a silicon wafer that come out working versus how many are garbage. Low yields mean higher costs. And Intel's 10 nanometer yields were so bad that many of their processors still had to be made on the ancient 14 nanometer process. Let me put this in perspective. Intel's flagship CPUs were stuck on 14 nanometers from 2014 all the way into 2020, 6 years on the same manufacturing node. That is unprecedented stagnation for a company that built its entire reputation on relentless advancement. Meanwhile, TSMC was shipping 7 nanometer chips in high volume starting in 2018. Smaller, faster, more efficient. And who were they making them for? Apple, AMD, and NVIDIA. All the companies that were suddenly eating Intel's lunch in terms of performance and power efficiency. Then came the 7 nanometer catastrophe. In July 2020, Intel dropped a bombshell. They were delaying their own 7 nanometer process indefinitely because of, you guessed it, yield problems. They admitted publicly that they were now 2 to 3 years behind TSMC in manufacturing technology. 2 to 3 years behind. The company that had led the semiconductor industry for decades was now trailing the competition by multiple generations. And here's where the foundry strategy completely collapsed. Who in their right mind is going to trust Intel to manufacture their cutting-edge chips when Intel literally can't manufacture their own? 0 major customers were signing up for Intel Foundry services because the entire value proposition, Intel's supposed technological superiority, had completely evaporated. But the humiliation didn't stop there. In 2020, Apple announced they were transitioning all of their Mac computers away from Intel processors to their own custom ARM-based chips. And who was manufacturing those chips? TSMC, of course. That's like your partner leaving you for your more successful, better-looking cousin. And what about AMD? Using TSMC's 7 nanometer process, they were suddenly making CPUs that were faster and more efficient than Intel's chips for the first time in over a decade. The company Intel had dominated for years was now beating them with technology manufactured by the very foundry Intel thought they could easily compete against. The brutal irony was complete. Intel's foundry business depended on a manufacturing advantage that no longer existed. They had bet billions on becoming the next TSMC, while simultaneously losing the technological edge that made them Intel in the first place. And just when you thought it couldn't possibly get any worse, Intel's biggest, most important customers started heading for the exits. In business, there's losing customers, and then there's what happened to Intel between 2020 and 2021. The Apple Mac transition was the most visible and symbolic blow. For years, Intel Inside was a core part of the Mac experience. But Apple's own M-series chips, built by TSMC, offered such a massive leap in performance and battery life that it made Intel's offerings look ancient overnight. This wasn't just a lost contract. It was a public declaration that Intel was no longer the best. Apple, one of the biggest and most demanding customers in the world, had fired Intel. This sent a shockwave through the entire industry. If Apple was willing to invest billions to ditch Intel, what did that say about Intel's future? It turned out other big players were thinking the same thing. In the high-stakes world of data centers and cloud computing, companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google started designing their own custom server chips. Again, based on ARM architecture and manufactured by TSMC. For decades, Intel had a near monopoly on the server market, which was their most profitable business segment. But now, their largest customers were becoming their competitors. using TSMC's superior manufacturing to build chips that were often more efficient and cost-effective for their specific needs. Intel wasn't just losing market share, they were losing the entire market to a new model of business they had failed to adapt to. So, let's tally up the cost of this failed foundry experiment. We're talking about billions of dollars in lost R&D, factories that weren't optimized for external customers, and a catastrophic loss of focus. While Intel was chasing the foundry dream, they took their eye off their core business, allowing their manufacturing leadership to completely collapse. This one strategic mistake is estimated to have cost Intel well over $50 billion in lost market value and revenue. And that's a conservative estimate. The story isn't over, though. Under new leadership, Intel has launched an ambitious comeback plan. They've rebranded their foundry business to Intel Foundry, and they are investing over $100 billion to build new factories in the US and Europe. They're basically trying to do a reboot, promising to catch up to and even surpass TSMC by 2025. This time, they claim they've learned their lesson and are building a true customer-first foundry culture. But the challenge is immense. They're trying to rebuild their technological leadership, while simultaneously trying to win the trust of customers they either competed with or let down in the past. Can Intel pull it off? It's one of the biggest questions in the tech world today. It's a story of ambition, arrogance, and the humbling lesson that even for a giant like Intel, you can't be the best at everything all at once. The foundry trap showed that chasing your competitor's business model can sometimes lead you to lose your own. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. See you in the next one. For nearly 15 years since 2006, every single Mac had an Intel processor inside. Then Apple made a change. They announced their own Apple Silicon chips, and just like that, Intel lost a partner that brought in $3 to $4 billion a year. But it was never just about the money. This was a public declaration. Apple was saying, we can design better chips than you can make. That was just the first domino. Next, the giants of cloud computing started to walk away. Amazon Web Services revealed their own custom ARM processors, Graviton. And guess who was making them? TSMC. Google developed its own server chips. Microsoft began designing custom processors for their own data centers. These were the exact companies Intel hoped would use its new foundry business. Instead, they designed their own silicon and gave the manufacturing business to Intel's competitors. Intel had also bet heavily on the automotive industry, thinking self-driving cars would need massive processing power. But car makers weren't interested. They wanted proven reliability, which they found at TSMC and Samsung. The customers Intel was counting on simply went elsewhere. The scorecard tells the whole story. Back in 2013, when Intel announced its foundry ambitions, analysts predicted they could land 20 or more major customers by 2020. The reality? Maybe 2 or 3 minor ones. Nobody wanted to risk their products on Intel's struggling manufacturing. Even Microsoft, one of Intel's oldest partners, started using ARM-based chips in some Surface devices. Chips made by, you guessed it, not Intel. Then came the final blow. In January 2021, Intel announced they were thinking about outsourcing their own chip production, specifically to TSMC and Samsung. Let's get this straight. The company that wanted to manufacture chips for everyone else now needed to hire its biggest rivals to make its own processors because its factories couldn't keep up. It's like a world-famous chef opening a new restaurant, failing, and then having to order takeout from other restaurants to serve to his own customers. The irony was suffocating. Intel's grand foundry plan had become a trap. They'd spent billions trying to build a business that demanded manufacturing excellence while losing the very excellence that made them Intel in the first place. So, what did this disaster cost? Buckle up, because the numbers are staggering. Between 2020 and 2023, Intel lost over $50 billion in market value. That's more than the entire GDP of countries like Jordan or Paraguay. Just gone. Let's break down this financial bloodbath. At its peak in 2020, Intel's market cap was around $290 billion. By late 2022, it had crashed below $130 billion. That's a loss of over $160 billion in shareholder value in just 2 years. Even after clawing back some ground in 2023, they were still down massively. The stock price tells the same brutal story. Shares that traded around $68 in early 2020 plummeted to under $26 by October 2022. That's a 60% collapse. Meanwhile, their business was cratering. Data center revenue, once Intel's crown jewel, dropped by over 30% year over year in late 2022. Billions in quarterly revenue just vanished as customers chose AMD or designed their own chips. And the foundry division? Billions invested for almost no revenue, racking up massive annual losses. But here's what makes it even more painful. While Intel was bleeding cash, their competitors were printing money. TSMC's market cap grew by over $200 billion during the same period. NVIDIA exploded from around $150 billion to over $1 trillion by 2023, all thanks to the AI boom powered by chips made by TSMC. AMD's value more than tripled as they gobbled up market share using, you guessed it, TSMC's manufacturing. Intel wasn't just losing, everyone else was winning. TSMC was operating at around 60% gross margins because every cutting-edge company on the planet needed them. Intel watched its own margins get crushed. The stock comparisons are devastating. From 2019 to 2023, Intel's stock was down around 30 to 40%. NVIDIA's stock in that same period, up over 800%. AMD, up over 200%. TSMC gained roughly 70%. Intel didn't just stumble, they fell while watching their rivals achieve historic growth. The human cost started piling up too. In 2022 and 2023, Intel announced layoffs for over 15,000 employees. Factories in Oregon and Arizona, once symbols of American tech dominance, were cutting shifts and idling production lines. Even while spending $15 to $20 billion a year on R&D, one of the highest budgets in tech, Intel had nothing to show for it on the manufacturing front. They were burning cash at an incredible rate just to stay years behind the competition. And those are just the numbers. The real-world consequences were even more insane. This wasn't just about Intel's bank account. America's dominance in chip manufacturing was dying, and Intel's failure was speeding up the decline. Back in 1990, the United States produced about 37% of the world's semiconductors. By 2020, that number had collapsed to just 12%. Intel's inability to compete with TSMC was a huge part of this story. The world's most advanced chips were now almost exclusively made in Taiwan, just 100 miles from mainland China. The Pentagon was not happy. America's most advanced weapons, fighter jets, and defense networks all depend on these cutting-edge chips. Suddenly, the U.S. military was reliant on a supply chain located on an island that China claims as its own territory. National security experts sounded the alarm. If anything happened to Taiwan, the entire American tech industry and military could face a chip shortage that would make the COVID-era crisis look like a minor inconvenience. Beyond geopolitics, there was a massive human cost. Intel's best engineers started to leave. Talented chip designers and manufacturing experts jumped ship to TSMC, AMD, NVIDIA, and startups. When a company loses its technological edge, it loses its best people. A brain drain set in hard. The ecosystem of suppliers that had built businesses around Intel's Foundry promises also got crushed. Companies that invested in tools for Intel's manufacturing had to pivot or die. And then there's the broader innovation slowdown. For years, the PC industry stagnated because Intel's chips just weren't improving at their historic pace. Software developers, gamers, and creative professionals were all stuck waiting for performance boosts that never came. Intel's failure held back entire sectors of technology. For the 15,000 plus employees laid off, this wasn't just a statistic. It was families disrupted and careers derailed. The communities in Oregon and Arizona felt the economic pain directly. But perhaps the hardest to measure was the damage to their reputation. Intel Inside used to mean you had the best. By 2023, it often meant you were stuck with something slower and less efficient than the competition. The brand that once symbolized excellence had become a punchline in tech circles. The story of Intel's fall is a complex web of missed opportunities, strategic blunders, and fierce competition. It is a cautionary tale about how quickly a giant can stumble when it loses its focus and its edge. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of technology. See you next time. Intel went from being the undisputed king of chips, the company everyone else was scared of, to a cautionary tale taught in business schools. A story of arrogance and massive strategic mistakes. With Intel on the ropes and America's chip future looking shaky, could they actually pull off a comeback? Well, enter Pat Gelsinger, Intel's new CEO and supposed savior. Gelsinger is an old-school Intel engineer who spent decades at the company before leaving to run VMware. In February 2021, Intel brought him back to clean up the mess. His big plan? A strategy called IDM 2.0. The idea was incredibly ambitious. Intel would make its own chips, run a real foundry business for other companies, and use outside foundries when it made sense. So Intel's solution to failing at the foundry business was to try the foundry business again, but this time way harder. Gelsinger announced gigantic expansion plans. We're talking a $20 billion investment in new fabs in Ohio, another $20 billion to expand in Arizona, and a $17 billion factory in Germany. This is one of the largest manufacturing build-outs in the history of semiconductors. And he got help. Big help. The U.S. government passed the CHIPS Act in 2022, handing Intel $8.5 billion in direct funding, plus access to cheap loans and huge tax breaks. It was basically a taxpayer-funded lifeline to keep American chip manufacturing afloat. To Gelsinger's credit, we have seen some progress. Intel finally shipped their Intel 4 and Intel 3 process nodes in 2022 and 2023. These are pretty competitive with TSMC's older generation nodes, which is a good sign, even if they're not at the cutting edge. At least Intel's chips are improving again after years of just sitting still. The company also managed to land a few Foundry customers. Qualcomm signed up for some limited production, and Amazon Web Services committed to using Intel foundries for custom chips. These are encouraging signs, but the revenue from these deals is still tiny compared to what Intel needs to justify its massive investments. But here's the reality check. Intel's entire future really depends on their next generation processes, called 20A and 18A, which are promised for 2024 and 2025. These are the nodes that are supposed to finally let Intel catch up to TSMC's leading-edge tech. The problem is, they've already faced delays, and it's not clear if Intel can actually deliver on these super ambitious timelines. Even if everything goes perfectly, and let's be honest, Intel's track record suggests that's a big if, they still need to nail the technology, win over major foundry customers, fix their manufacturing yields, and compete with TSMC's 3 nanometer and 2 nanometer processes that are either already here or coming very soon. That is a whole lot of ands that all have to work out perfectly, all at the same time. So, will Intel's comeback actually work? Only time will tell. But here's what we know for sure. Here's the brutal truth about Intel's $50 billion mistake. As of 2024, Intel's market cap is hovering around $100 to $150 billion. That's still way down from its peak of nearly $300 billion back in 2020. Their core CPU business continues to lose market share to AMD in both the consumer and data center markets. And revenue in their key segments is either declining or just flat. Meanwhile, TSMC remains the undisputed king of foundries, with over 60% of the market share for advanced chip manufacturing. The first lesson from Intel's disaster: never ever underestimate how hard it is to pivot your entire business model. Intel just assumed that because they were brilliant at making their own chips, they could easily make chips for everyone else too. But being excellent at manufacturing for yourself is a totally different game than manufacturing as a service for others. They completely ignored the decades of knowledge and experience that TSMC had built specifically for foundry work. The second lesson is that arrogance kills. For years, Intel just dismissed TSMC's expertise, basically saying, "We're Intel, we invented the microprocessor, we know manufacturing better than anyone." That hubris made them blind to the huge cultural and technical differences between their integrated model and the pure-play foundry business. They thought their name was enough, and they were wrong. It's a tough lesson, but one they are now spending billions to try and unlearn. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives. By the time Intel realized the problem, their competitors were already years ahead. This brings us to our third lesson. Manufacturing delays compound exponentially. Missing the 10 nanometer mark by just 1 year snowballed into being 3 years behind on 7 nanometer. In the world of semiconductors, falling behind isn't something you can just fix with overtime. The gap only gets wider because while you're busy solving yesterday's problems, your rivals are already building tomorrow's technology. The bigger picture here goes beyond just Intel. America's dream of chip independence is hanging in the balance, relying on both Intel's recovery and the success of government funding like the CHIPS Act. But even with all that support, there's absolutely no guarantee. The competitive landscape is harsh. Even if Intel nails its 18A process, TSMC will already be mass producing 2 nanometer chips. Catching up doesn't mean you've won, it just means you're finally back in the race. Thanks for watching.